The dust settled around Preston Sullivan's boots as he stood on the porch of his modest ranch house, squinting against the harsh Wyoming sun. It was 1878, and Walla Walla had seen better days. The drought had lasted longer than anyone could remember. Cattle were dying, and now this a rider approaching at breakneck speed, clearly bearing news that wouldn't wait. Sullivan. The man's voice cracked as he pulled his horse to a stop, sending a cloud of dust billowing upward. It's your boy. Daniel's taken ill. Preston's heart slammed against his ribs. His 6-year-old son had been staying with Preston's sister in Laramie while he worked to save what remained of his struggling cattle ranch. What's happened? Preston demanded, already moving toward the stable. Doc says it's scarlet fever. Bad case, you'd best hurry. The messenger wiped sweat from his brow. Half the children in Laramie are down with it. Preston didn't need to hear more. Within minutes, he had saddled his Palomino, Chance, and was riding east with nothing but his revolver, canteen, and the clothes on his back. 3 days, he told himself. 3 days to Laramie if he pushed hard. But as the first night fell and he made camp beside a dried creek bed, Preston couldn't shake the hollow feeling in his chest. Martha had been gone 2 years now, taken by childbirth complications along with the baby girl they'd been so eager to welcome. Daniel was all he had left in this world. I'm coming, son, he whispered to the stars. Hold on. Morning came with relentless heat. Preston pushed Chance harder than was wise, stopping only when necessary. By midday, he'd crossed into more treacherous territory, Apache land, though relations had been peaceful lately. Still, a lone rider made an easy target for anyone with bad intentions. The attack came just before dusk, not Apache, but white men, 3 of them, emerging from behind rock formations like rattlesnakes. Look what we got here, boys, said the leader, a man with a scar splitting his left eyebrow. Riding mighty fast for a man who ain't running from something. Preston's hand hovered near his pistol. I've got no quarrel with you. My son's sick in Laramie, I need to get there. The scarred man laughed. That's mighty unfortunate. But your horse looks fresh enough, and we've been walking since Cheyenne. Preston didn't hesitate. His draw was fast the product of years when he'd been more gunslinger than rancher. The first shot caught the leader in the shoulder. The second missed as Preston dove from Chance's back, taking cover behind a boulder as bullets splintered the rock above him. The firefight was brief but costly. When silence fell, Preston found himself with a bullet graze across his ribs, his horse gone, and 2 dead men lying in the dust. The third had fled, taking Chance with him. Damn it all, Preston muttered, binding his wound with a strip torn from his shirt. Night was falling, and he was miles from anywhere, wounded and on foot. He walked until the moon rose high, following the trail east until his legs trembled with exhaustion. When he could go no further, he collapsed beneath a juniper tree, his thoughts on Daniel's feverish face. I'm sorry, son, he whispered before unconsciousness claimed him. When Preston opened his eyes, dawn was breaking and he wasn't alone. A woman sat across from a small fire, stirring something in a battered pot. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical braid, her clothes dusty but well made. Beside her was a sorrel mare, saddled and loaded with supplies. You're lucky I found you before the coyotes did, she said without looking up. That wound needs proper tending. Preston tried to sit up, wincing at the pain in his side. Who are you, Nora Vance? She finally turned to face him, revealing striking green eyes in a sun-tanned face. Dr. Nora Vance, I'm heading to Laramie. Laramie, Preston struggled to his feet. That's where I'm bound. My son is sick. Yes, I know. I overheard at the telegraph office in Casper. They're bringing in doctors from all over to help with the outbreak. She handed him a tin cup of coffee. You won't make it there bleeding like that, Mr. Sullivan. Preston blinked in surprise. How do your reputation precedes you? Even in Denver, people speak of Preston Sullivan, the gunslinger who hung up his pistols to raise cattle and a son alone. She offered a small smile. Drink your coffee. I'll see to your wound and then we can ride together. My mare can carry us both for a while. Preston studied her face, looking for deceit and finding none. "Why would you help me, Dr. Vance?" Her expression softened slightly. "Because there are children dying in Laramie, Mr. Sullivan, and because no child should lose their father if it can be prevented." She gestured to his side. "Now, let me see that wound before infection sets in." As she cleaned and bandaged his injury with practiced hands, Preston watched her face. She was younger than he'd initially thought, perhaps 30 to his 38 years, with a quiet determination in her movements. "You're a long way from Denver," he observed. "I go where I'm needed." She tied off the bandage. "There aren't many women doctors, Mr. Sullivan. Those of us who have managed to earn our degrees find we must work twice as hard to prove ourselves worthy of the title." "Call me Preston," he said, testing his side as he stood, "and thank you." They set off within the hour, Preston seated behind Nora on her mare. The proximity was uncomfortable at first. He hadn't been this close to a woman since Martha, but necessity overcame awkwardness as the miles passed. "How old is your son?" Nora asked as they followed a winding trail between hills. "6, Preston replied, smart as a whip, too smart for his own good sometimes. And his mother, Preston's silence answered for him. "I'm sorry," Nora said softly. "I shouldn't have pried." "It's been 2 years, Preston finally said. "Childbed fever, we lost the baby to a little girl." Nora nodded, her back straight against his chest. "Too many women die that way. It's one of the reasons I became a doctor, my own mother." She trailed off. "Let's just say I understand what your boy has lost." They rode through the day, stopping only to rest the horse and eat a sparse meal from Nora's provisions. By sunset, they'd made good progress but were still a day's ride from Laramie. "There's a homestead about a mile ahead," Nora said as darkness fell. "I treated the farmer's wife last year when I passed through. They'll give us shelter for the night." The Baker family welcomed them with cautious hospitality. Strangers were always viewed with suspicion in these parts, but a doctor was a valuable acquaintance. Mrs. Baker served them a simple stew while their children watched with curious eyes. "You're heading straight into trouble," Mr. Baker warned as they ate. "Half of Laramie's down with the fever. They've set up a quarantine tent at the edge of town." "That's where I'm needed," Nora replied calmly. "And my son is there," Preston added. Mrs. Baker exchanged a look with her husband. "I'll pack you extra food for the journey," she said, laying a gentle hand on Preston's arm. That night, Preston slept fitfully on the baker's floor, his dreams filled with Daniel's face, pale and calling for him. He woke before dawn to find Nora already up, repacking her medical bag. "We should reach Laramie by nightfall if we push hard," she said without preamble. They set off as the first light broke over the eastern horizon. The terrain grew more familiar to Preston as they neared Laramie, but his anxiety mounted with each passing mile. "What if they were too late? Tell me about your son," Nora said after they'd been riding in silence for nearly an hour. Preston cleared his throat. "Daniel's. He's everything good about Martha and nothing of my darker parts. Gentle-hearted but tough when he needs to be, loves animals, reads everything he can get his hands on." "He sounds remarkable, he is." Preston's voice roughened. "When Martha died, I nearly lost myself in grief. Would have if not for him. He needed me, so I had to keep going." Nora was quiet for a moment. "Children have a way of anchoring us to this world when everything else would pull us under." Something in her tone made Preston study the back of her head. "You speak like someone who knows." She didn't respond immediately. When she did, her voice was carefully controlled. "I was married once, briefly. There was a child, a daughter." She clicked her tongue, urging the horse over a rocky patch. "She would be about your son's age now." "I'm sorry," Preston said, understanding dawning. "What happened?" Cholera took them both. "I was studying medicine in Philadelphia at the time." Her shoulders stiffened. "I couldn't save them. That's when I decided to come west. Too many memories in the east." Preston found himself resting a hand briefly on her shoulder before he realized what he was doing. "I'm sorry," he repeated. Inadequate as the words were, they rode on, the shared weight of their losses hanging between them like a tangible thing. By mid-afternoon, storm clouds had gathered, turning the sky an ominous gray-green. They pushed on even as the first fat raindrops began to fall, knowing shelter was scarce in this stretch of country. The storm broke with sudden violence. Lightning split the sky, and the sorrel mare reared in fright as thunder cracked overhead. Preston wrapped his arm around Nora's waist to steady her as she fought to control the horse. "There," he shouted over the wind, pointing to a small cabin half hidden among trees to their right. "Abandoned hunting lodge. We can wait out the worst of it there." They made a dash for the shelter, rain soaking them to the skin before they reached the door. The cabin was dusty but intact, with a stone fireplace and a single room containing a rough-hewn table and bed frame. Preston quickly gathered the driest wood he could find while Nora tended to her frightened horse in the lean-to attached to the cabin's side. Within 20 minutes, they had a small fire going, its light casting long shadows on the cabin walls. "We've lost hours," Preston said, staring grimly at the deluge outside. "Daniel is being cared for," Nora finished firmly, wringing water from her braid. "Your sister will see to that, and the sooner we arrive, the sooner I can help him." She was shivering despite her brave words. Without thinking, Preston shrugged out of his duster damp but warmer than her soaked blouse and draped it around her shoulders. "Thank you," she said, pulling it close. Their eyes met for a moment too long before she looked away, moving closer to the fire. "You should rest. Your wound needs time to heal, and will ride out as soon as the storm passes." Preston nodded, though rest seemed impossible with his son's life hanging in the balance. He settled on the floor near the fire, his back against the wall, watching as Nora opened her medical bag and took inventory of her supplies. "How did you become a doctor?" he asked, partly to distract himself from his worries, partly out of genuine curiosity. A small smile played at her lips. "My father was a physician in Boston. He had no sons, only me and my sister. While Rebecca was content with the usual feminine accomplishments, I followed my father on his rounds from the time I could walk." She reorganized some bottles in her bag. "He encouraged my interest, educated me as he would have a son. When I was 18, he helped me apply to the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania. That couldn't have been easy. It wasn't." Her smile faded. "My husband Edward was initially supportive, then he wasn't. Then he was gone, taking our daughter with him to his parents' home while I finished my studies." She closed her bag with a snap. "As I said, cholera took them before I could graduate." Preston watched the firelight play across her face. "And you've been traveling ever since. 4 years now." "I follow the sickness, the epidemics, the outbreaks. I go where most doctors won't." She looked up at him. "What about you, Preston Sullivan? I've heard stories about the man you were before you became a rancher." Preston's jaw tightened. "Those stories are probably true. I was young, angry, and too fast with a gun. I did things I'm not proud of. And then I met Martha. She was teaching school in a mining town where I'd stopped for work. She saw something in me worth saving." He rubbed a hand over his face. "We had 5 good years before she died." The rain drummed steadily on the roof, filling the silence between them. Finally, Nora spoke again. "Get some rest, Preston. I'll wake you when the storm passes." Despite his protests, exhaustion soon pulled Preston into sleep. He dreamed of Daniel, of Martha, and strangely, of Nora Vance with her determined green eyes and gentle hands. When he woke, the rain had stopped and pale light filtered through the cabin's single window. Nora was already preparing to leave, her mare saddled and waiting outside. "We should reach Laramie by midday," she said, offering him a piece of dried beef. "Eat, you'll need your strength." The landscape had transformed overnight, muddy and treacherous. They rode carefully, picking their way along higher ground. As the sun climbed higher, Preston's anxiety returned full force. "Tell me about scarlet fever," he said abruptly. "What are Daniel's chances?" Nora hesitated. "It depends on many factors. The severity of the infection, the child's underlying health, how quickly treatment began." She turned slightly in the saddle to look at him. "Children can and do recover, Preston, but I won't lie to you, it's serious," He nodded, his throat tight. "Thank you for your honesty. When we arrive, I'll examine him immediately," she promised. "Everything in my power, Preston." "That's what I'll do for your son." By the time Laramie appeared on the horizon, Preston's heart was hammering. The town looked different from his last visit, quieter with few people on the streets. As they approached, they could see the quarantine tent Nora had mentioned, set up on the outskirts. Preston directed Nora toward his sister's house, a small but well-kept home on the eastern edge of town. As they dismounted, the front door flew open. "Preston, thank God." His sister Amelia rushed down the steps, her face drawn with exhaustion. "I've been praying you'd make it. Daniel." The word came out as barely more than a whisper, Amelia's eyes filled with tears. "He's holding on, but Preston." She glanced at Nora. "Who's this?" "Dr. Vance," Nora said, stepping forward. "I've come to help with the outbreak. May I see the boy?" Amelia's expression shifted from suspicion to desperate hope. "A doctor? Yes, of course, this way." She led them into the house and up a narrow staircase to a small bedroom. Preston's heart nearly stopped at the sight of his son, so small against the white sheets, his face flushed with fever. A red rash covered his neck and chest. "Daniel," Preston whispered, dropping to his knees beside the bed. The boy's eyelids fluttered. "Pa," the word was barely audible. "You came." "Of course I came." Preston took his son's hot hand. "I'll always come for you, son." Nora was already unpacking her bag, her professional demeanor firmly in place. "Mr. Sullivan, I need to examine your son now. Perhaps you could wait downstairs while I work," Preston started to protest, but Amelia placed a hand on his arm. "Let the doctor work, Preston." "Come, I'll make you some coffee. You look half dead yourself." Reluctantly, Preston followed his sister downstairs. As she bustled around the kitchen, he sank into a chair, the events of the past 3 days catching up to him all at once. "Where did you find a woman doctor?" Amelia asked as she placed a steaming cup before him. "She found me," Preston replied, too exhausted for the full story. "How bad is it, Amelia? Tell me true." His sister's shoulders sagged. "The fever started 5 days ago. By the time we realized what it was, half the children in town were sick. 3 have died already." She wiped away a tear. "Daniel's strong, but last night—" "What happened last night?" He couldn't breathe properly, started turning blue around the lips. She clutched her apron. "That's when I sent for you. The town doctor's overwhelmed. He barely has time to check on each child once a day." Preston gripped his coffee cup so hard his knuckles turned white. "Dr. Vance will help him. She has to." It was nearly an hour before Nora came downstairs, her face serious but composed. "The infection is severe," she said without preamble. "His throat is badly swollen, which is making it difficult for him to breathe. The rash indicates the disease is well established." Preston stood, fear making his voice harsh. "Can you help him?" "I'm going to try." She turned to Amelia. "I need hot water as much as you can boil, clean cloths. And if you have honey, bring that too." She looked back at Preston. "I'm going to create a steam tent to help ease his breathing. Then we'll start with compresses to bring down the fever." For the next several hours, Preston watched as Nora worked tirelessly. She constructed a makeshift steam tent over Daniel's bed using sheets and a kettle of boiling water infused with herbs from her bag. She bathed the boy's burning skin with cool water, forced small amounts of liquid past his swollen throat, and administered medicines from her supplies. Night fell and still Nora worked. Preston brought her food, which she barely touched, cups of coffee which grew cold beside her. Amelia eventually retreated to her own room, exhausted, but Preston refused to leave. "You should rest," Nora told him around midnight, her own face drawn with fatigue. "There's nothing more you can do right now." "I can't leave him," Preston said, watching Daniel's labored breathing. "What if He's fighting," Nora said firmly, "and so must we. The next few hours will be critical." As if to emphasize her words, Daniel suddenly began to thrash, his breathing becoming more ragged. Nora moved instantly, lifting the boy and adjusting his position. "His throat's closing," she said tersely. "Preston, hold him upright while I prepare something." Preston cradled his son against his chest, terror gripping him as Daniel struggled for each breath. Nora worked quickly, mixing something in a small bowl. "This paste contains herbs to reduce the swelling," she explained, spreading it on a cloth. "I'm going to wrap it around his throat. It may help open his airway until the crisis passes." Preston watched as she applied the poultice, then held Daniel while she spooned a bitter-smelling liquid into his mouth. "What is that?" "An extract of foxglove, among other things. It will strengthen his heart while we fight the fever." She met Preston's eyes. "It's powerful medicine, dangerous if misused." "Do what you must," Preston said hoarsely. Throughout the night they worked together. Preston held Daniel during the worst of his convulsions, bathed his burning skin when Nora needed to prepare more medicines, and prayed as he hadn't since Martha's death. Dawn was breaking when Daniel's fever finally broke. The terrible rasping of his breath eased and he fell into a deep, natural sleep. "He's past the worst," Nora said, her voice heavy with exhaustion. She swayed slightly where she stood. Preston caught her before she could fall, guiding her to the chair beside Daniel's bed. "You need rest. You've been working for over 24 hours. "I should check on the other children," she protested weakly. "The quarantine tent will still be there after you've slept," Preston insisted. "You're no good to anyone if you collapse." She didn't have the strength to argue further. Preston helped her to Amelia's spare room, where she fell asleep almost before her head touched the pillow. When she woke, it was late afternoon. She found Preston sitting beside Daniel's bed, reading aloud from a tattered book of adventure stories. "How is he?" she asked from the doorway. Preston looked up, relief evident in his face. "Better, much better. His fever's down and he's been awake twice, even took some broth." Daniel stirred at the sound of their voices. His eyes, still glazed but more focused than before, found Nora. "Are you an angel?" he asked in a raspy whisper. Nora smiled, moving to the bedside. "No, Daniel, I'm a doctor. I'm helping you get better." "She saved your life, son," Preston said, his voice rough with emotion. "Dr. Vance rode all the way from Denver to help the sick children here in Laramie." Daniel's eyes widened slightly. "Thank you, madam." "You're very welcome." Nora checked his pulse, then felt his forehead. "You're a brave boy, Daniel Sullivan, and you're getting stronger already." The next few days established a routine. Nora divided her time between Daniel and the other sick children in town. Preston stayed by his son's side, watching in amazement as Daniel grew stronger under Nora's care. A week after their arrival in Laramie, the scarlet fever outbreak began to wane. Of the 23 children who had fallen ill, 19 survived, a remarkable outcome that the townsfolk attributed to the lady doctor from Denver and her tireless efforts. Preston found Nora at the quarantine tent late one evening, packing her supplies. Daniel was well enough now to sit up in bed and ask for his favorite foods. The worst of the danger had passed. "You're leaving," he said, not a question but a statement. She nodded without looking up. "There's word of influenza in a mining camp near Cheyenne. They've asked for medical help." "Always moving on to the next crisis. It's what I do." She finally met his gaze. "Your son will make a full recovery, Preston. Keep him quiet for another week, then he can gradually return to normal activities." Preston stepped closer. "You saved his life." "I did my job." "No." He shook his head. "What you did goes beyond duty. You could have gone straight to the quarantine tent when we arrived. There were many children who needed help, but you came to Daniel first." Nora looked away. He was in critical condition, so were others. Preston gently turned her face back toward his. "Why, Nora? Why did you help me specifically? From the moment you found me wounded on the trail, you've been more than just a doctor doing her duty." For a long moment she was silent. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "My daughter's name was Emily. She was 4 when she died." Nora's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "I wasn't there. I was at the medical college learning how to save lives while my own child." She took a shaky breath. "When I heard about your son, about a father racing across dangerous country to reach his sick child, I thought of Edward. He was with Emily when she died, holding her while I was hundreds of miles away." Preston's throat tightened. "Nora, you didn't abandon your son," she continued. "You were coming for him, doing everything humanly possible to reach him, I thought. Perhaps helping you was a way to make peace with my own failure." "You didn't fail," Preston said firmly. "You've been saving other people's children ever since, including mine." A single tear escaped, trailing down her cheek. Preston brushed it away with his thumb, his hand lingering against her face. "Stay," he said softly. Nora stepped back, composing herself. "I can't. There are people who need me. We need you." The words surprised even him. "Laramie has no proper doctor. The man who's here is old, overworked. The town would welcome you with open arms after what you've done." "And what would I be to you, Preston Sullivan?" she asked quietly. The question hung between them, loaded with possibility. Preston had not allowed himself to think beyond Daniel's recovery, had not acknowledged the growing feeling in his chest whenever Nora entered a room. "Whatever you wanted to be," he finally answered. "Friend, colleague," he hesitated. "Perhaps someday more, but I'm not asking for that. I'm asking you to consider making Laramie your home for your own sake as well as ours." Nora turned back to her packing, her movements deliberate. "I'll think about it, but I've made a commitment to go to that mining camp. People are dying there too." Preston nodded, understanding even as disappointment settled in his chest. "How long will you be gone?" "A few weeks. Perhaps a month, and then," she looked up at him, a small smile playing at her lips, "and then perhaps I'll return to check on my patient." It was as much of a promise as she could give, and Preston accepted it with a nod. The following morning, Nora said her goodbyes. She spent extra time with Daniel, showing him how to strengthen his lungs by blowing a feather across a table and giving him a small wooden whistle to practice with. "You're going to be just fine," she told him, straightening his blanket. "Your father will take good care of you." Daniel looked at her solemnly. "Will you come back, Dr. Nora?" She glanced at Preston, who stood in the doorway. "I hope so, Daniel." Preston walked her to where her mare waited, saddled and loaded with fresh supplies provided by the grateful townspeople. "Be careful," he said as she mounted. "That trail to Cheyenne isn't safe for a woman traveling alone." "I've managed this far," she replied with a hint of amusement. "But I appreciate your concern." Before she could ride away, Preston took her hand. "Thank you isn't enough, but it's all I have to offer right now." Her fingers tightened briefly around his. "It's enough, Preston. Take care of your boy." And then she was gone, riding west toward Cheyenne and the mining camp beyond. Preston watched until she disappeared from view, a strange hollowness in his chest that had nothing to do with Daniel's illness. The next month passed slowly. Daniel regained his strength day by day, soon well enough to move back to their ranch outside Walla Walla. Preston hired extra hands to manage the cattle while he devoted himself to his son's recovery. Together, they rebuilt what the drought had damaged, replanted the kitchen garden, and reinforced the corrals. But as summer turned to autumn, Preston found himself watching the eastern horizon, hoping for a rider that never appeared. "Is Dr. Nora coming today, Pa?" Daniel would ask periodically, and Preston would ruffle his hair and say, "Not today, son, but maybe tomorrow." The first snow fell in early November, coating the ranch in white stillness. Preston sat on the porch after putting Daniel to bed, nursing a cup of coffee and watching his breath plume in the cold air. He'd given up hope of Nora's return weeks ago. She had moved on to another crisis, another town that needed her skills. It was what she did. The sound of approaching hooves made him sit up straight, hand moving automatically to the revolver he still wore out of habit. A lone rider emerged from the darkness, bundled against the cold. "Hello, the house," called a familiar voice. Preston was on his feet in an instant. "Nora." She dismounted stiffly, leading her mare toward the hitching post. "I told you I'd come back to check on my patient." "You're 3 weeks late," he said, moving to help her with her horse. The influenza was worse than expected. Then there was a measles outbreak in a Shoshone village. She unwound the scarf from her face, revealing chapped lips and tired eyes. "I came as soon as I could." Preston wanted to embrace her but restrained himself. Come inside, it's freezing out here." The warmth of the house enveloped them as they entered. Nora looked around with approval at the tidy main room with its blazing fire. "How is Daniel?" she asked, removing her gloves. "See for yourself in the morning. He's asleep now and better than new." Preston took her coat. "Are you hungry? I can heat up some stew." "Starving," she admitted. "I haven't eaten a proper meal in days." As she ate, Preston told her about their return to the ranch, about Daniel's full recovery and his growing interest in reading and animals. Nora listened, asking occasional questions, but he could see the exhaustion in the slump of her shoulders. "You should rest," he said, taking her empty bowl. "I've made up the spare room. We can talk more tomorrow." She nodded gratefully. "I am tired. It's been a long journey. How long can you stay?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual. Nora hesitated. "I'm not sure. There's no immediate crisis calling me elsewhere for once." Something in her tone made Preston look at her more closely. But I've been offered a position at a new hospital in Denver. They want a woman doctor to treat female patients." She twisted her hands in her lap. "It would mean stability, regular hours, a home." "That sounds like a good opportunity," Preston said carefully, ignoring the sinking feeling in his chest. "It is." Nora stood, smoothing her skirts. "I should see the room now, if you don't mind. We can discuss this more tomorrow." Preston showed her to the spare room, painfully aware of her presence in his home, a home that had known only his and Daniel's footsteps for so long. "Good night, Nora," he said softly. "Good night, Preston." She paused at the door. "Thank you for welcoming me." Morning brought Daniel's delighted exclamations at finding Dr. Nora at the breakfast table. He bombarded her with questions about her travels and proudly demonstrated how strong his lungs had become by playing the wooden whistle she'd given him. "You've done very well, Daniel," she praised, examining his throat and chest. "I don't think you'll have any lasting effects from your illness." "Thanks to you," Preston said from the stove, where he was cooking flapjacks. After breakfast, Daniel went outside to feed the chickens, leaving Preston and Nora alone at the table. "I've been thinking about your hospital position," Preston said, refilling her coffee cup. "It sounds perfect for you." "It would be a change," she acknowledged. "No more constant traveling. No more making do with whatever supplies I can carry." "You deserve that stability," Preston said, meaning it despite his own wishes. "After all you've given to others." Nora studied him over her coffee cup. "I sense a but coming, Preston Sullivan," he smiled faintly. "No, but just a question." "What is it you want, Nora? Not what duty dictates, not what makes the most professional sense. What do you want for yourself?" She set down her cup, her expression thoughtful. "I've spent so long running from place to place, I'm not sure I remember how to want things for myself." She looked out the window where Daniel could be seen scattering feed for the chickens. "When Emily died, I thought I'd never want a family again. It hurt too much to lose them. And now," her eyes returned to his. "Now I find myself wondering what it would be like to belong somewhere, to someone." Preston reached across the table, covering her hand with his. "You could belong here if you wanted to." "As what, Preston? The town doctor who lives at the Sullivan Ranch. People would talk. Let them talk." His fingers tightened on hers. "Or you could be my wife, Daniel's mother." That would silence the gossips quickly enough. Nora's eyes widened. "Are you proposing, Mr. Sullivan?" Inelegantly, perhaps. He smiled, though his heart hammered in his chest. "I'm not asking out of gratitude, Nora, or convenience, these past months without you. I've realized what I felt growing between us wasn't just the intensity of Daniel's illness or our shared journey." "And what was it?" she asked softly. "The beginning of love," he said simply. "One that could grow stronger given the chance." Nora was silent for a long moment. "I barely know you." "You know the most important parts. You've seen me at my most desperate, my most vulnerable. You know what matters to me." He leaned forward. "The rest we can learn together." She withdrew her hand, but not unkindly. "I need time, Preston. This isn't a decision to make lightly." "Of course." He nodded, trying to hide his disappointment. "The hospital position can wait," she finished. "I told them I needed time to consider, perhaps." She smiled hesitantly. Perhaps I could stay here for a while, get to know Walla Walla, see if it might need a doctor. Hope flared in Preston's chest. The town would be lucky to have you, and so would we. No promises, she cautioned, just exploring possibilities. That's all I ask, Nora stayed. Days turned into weeks as winter settled fully over Wyoming. She established a small practice in town, using a room above the general store as her office. Word spread quickly of the woman doctor who had saved so many children during the scarlet fever outbreak, and soon patients came from miles around. At the ranch, she and Preston fell into an easy routine. She helped with the cooking, taught Daniel his letters and numbers, and gradually became an essential part of their small family. In the evenings, after Daniel was asleep, she and Preston would sit by the fire, talking long into the night about their pasts, their hopes, their fears. Preston learned about her childhood in Boston, about her father's progressive views and her mother's early death. She told him about her struggles at medical college, about the professors who refused to teach a woman, the male students who mocked her. In turn, he shared the darker parts of his own past, the gunfights that had made his reputation, the men he'd killed, the years of wandering before Martha had given him a reason to settle down. "I was so angry back then," he confessed one night in late December. "My father was a cruel man. Used his fists more than his words. When he finally died, I had all this rage and nowhere to put it." "Until you found your skill with a gun," Nora said, not judgmentally but understanding. "It gave me power I'd never had, made people respect me or at least fear me." He stared into the fire. "Martha was the first person who wasn't impressed by my reputation. She saw through it to the scared boy underneath." Nora moved from her chair to sit beside him on the sofa. "And now I hope I'm the man she believed I could be, for Daniel's sake." He looked at her, "and for my own." Christmas approached, bringing with it preparations that Daniel embraced with enthusiasm. He insisted on cutting a pine tree himself, with Preston's help, and decorating it with paper chains and strings of dried berries that he and Nora made together. On Christmas Eve, they attended the town's celebration at the small church in Walla Walla. The entire community gathered for carols, scripture readings, and a simple pageant performed by the children. Daniel had a small role as a shepherd, his lines delivered with solemn importance. As they rode home through the starlit night, Daniel asleep between them in the wagon, Preston felt a contentment he hadn't known in years. "Thank you," he said quietly. Nora looked at him questioningly. "For what?" "For making this Christmas special for Daniel. For healing more than just his body." Her smile was soft in the moonlight. "He's a remarkable child. You've done well with him, Preston. We make a good team," he said, the words carrying more weight than their simplicity suggested. Later, after Daniel had been tucked into bed with promises that Santa would come in the night, Preston and Nora sat before the fire, sharing a bottle of wine saved for the occasion. "I have something for you," Preston said, reaching into his pocket. "An early Christmas gift." He handed her a small wooden box carved with delicate wildflowers. Nora opened it carefully to find a slender gold ring with a single pearl. "It was my mother's," Preston explained. "The only thing of hers I have left." Nora looked up at him, her eyes wide. "Preston, I'm not rushing you," he said quickly. "This isn't a demand for an answer, it's just a promise that whenever you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'll be here." She cradled the box in her hands. "It's beautiful and meaningful coming from you." She took a deep breath. "I have something for you too, though it's not nearly so lovely." From her pocket, she withdrew an envelope and handed it to him. Preston opened it to find a letter from the Denver hospital, formally offering Dr. Nora Vance a position as staff physician. "I received it last week," she said, watching his face carefully. "They want an answer by the new year." Preston's heart sank, but he kept his expression neutral. "It's a wonderful opportunity. You'd be a fool to turn it down." "I already have." His head snapped up. "What?" Nora took the letter from his hands, folding it carefully. "I wrote to them yesterday, thanked them for the offer, but explained I've established a practice here that I can't abandon. Nora, I never meant to make you choose, you didn't. She placed a hand on his cheek. I chose for myself. For the first time in years, I chose what I wanted instead of what duty demanded. Preston covered her hand with his. And what is it you want? This, she said simply. A home, a purpose, people who need me for more than just my medical skills, she smiled. A future that doesn't involve constant running from my past. With us? He asked, barely daring to hope. With you, she confirmed, if that offer of yours still stands. Instead of answering, Preston drew her closer, his lips finding hers in a kiss that spoke more eloquently than words. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers. The offer stands, he murmured, for as long as you want it. Nora smiled, slipping the pearl ring onto her finger. Then I accept. Christmas morning dawned clear and cold. Daniel woke them at first light, bursting with excitement over the gifts that had appeared beneath the tree, a new leather-bound book of adventure stories. A carved wooden horse that Preston had spent weeks perfecting in secret. A set of paints and brushes that Nora had ordered from Denver. But the greatest gift came when Preston and Nora sat him down after breakfast to share their news. Dr. Nora is going to stay with us, Preston began carefully. Not just as our friend, but as part of our family. Daniel looked between them, his quick mind working through the implications. Like a ma, Nora's breath caught. If that would be all right with you, Daniel, I would never try to replace your mother, but her words were cut off as Daniel launched himself into her arms, hugging her tightly. I've been wishing for a ma, he confessed. Every night when I say my prayers. Tears filled Nora's eyes as she held him. Then I'll do my very best to be a good one. Preston watched them, his chest tight with emotion. The hole that Martha's death had left would never completely disappear. But here, in this moment, he felt it begin to heal in ways he had never thought possible. They were married on New Year's Day, 1879, in the same small church where they had celebrated Christmas. The entire town turned out for the ceremony, curious to witness the union of the former gunslinger and the woman doctor who had saved so many of their children. Daniel stood proudly as his father's best man, holding the rings on a small velvet cushion that Mrs. Baker from the neighboring farm had sewn especially for the occasion. As Preston slipped the pearl ring back onto Nora's finger, now accompanied by a simple gold band, he made a silent promise to Martha. I'll always remember you. But I'm living again for Daniel, for myself. I think you'd approve. That night, after Daniel had fallen asleep in his room, decorated with new curtains and a quilt that Nora had helped him choose, the newlyweds stood on the porch of their home, looking up at the winter stars. No regrets? Preston asked, his arm around his wife's shoulders. Nora leaned into him, her head resting against his chest. None. For the first time in years, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Spring came early that year, bringing new life to the ranch. Nora's practice flourished as word of her skills spread throughout the territory. She limited her hours to 3 days a week in town, devoting the rest of her time to the ranch and her new family. Daniel thrived under her care, his interest in medicine growing as she taught him about herbs and simple treatments. Preston found himself watching them together, heads bent over a book about anatomy. Hands working side by side in the small medicinal garden Nora had planted, and marveling at how completely she had become part of their lives. On a warm evening in May, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Nora took Preston's hand and placed it gently on her stomach. I'm going to need your help expanding the house, she said with a smile. We'll need another bedroom by winter. Preston stared at her, understanding dawning slowly. Are you certain? She nodded, her eyes bright. Very certain. The doctor confirms it. You're the doctor, he said with a laugh, pulling her into his arms. Even doctors need second opinions sometimes. She rested her head against his shoulder. Are you happy about this? Happy doesn't begin to cover it. He kissed the top of her head. How do you think Daniel will take the news? He's already asked me twice if he might have a brother or sister someday. She smiled against his shirt. I think he'll be pleased. Daniel was more than pleased, he was ecstatic. The prospect of a sibling filled his summer with planning and preparation. He helped Preston build the new bedroom, insisted on picking out colors for the baby's quilt, and solemnly informed everyone in town that he was going to be a big brother. The baby arrived on a snowy night in January 1880. Preston paced anxiously outside the bedroom door while Mrs. Baker and the town's midwife assisted Nora. Daniel sat on the stairs, clutching his wooden whistle for comfort. "Will Dr. Nora be all right, Pa?" he asked, his voice small. Preston sat beside him, putting an arm around his shoulders. "Your Ma is the strongest person I know, Daniel. And she knows more about bringing babies into the world than anyone for 100 miles. The reassurance was as much for himself as for his son. The memory of Martha's death lurked in the corners of his mind, despite his faith in Nora's knowledge and the presence of skilled help. The baby's first cry came just after midnight, strong and indignant. Minutes later, Mrs. Baker opened the door, her face wreathed in smiles. "You have a son, Mr. Sullivan," she announced. "Healthy as a horse and with a fine pair of lungs on him." Preston's knees nearly buckled with relief. "And Nora, tired but well. She's asking for you both." Daniel raced ahead of him into the room, stopping short at the sight of Nora propped up in bed, a small bundle in her arms. Preston followed more slowly, overwhelmed by the tableau before him. "Come meet your brother," Nora said softly, her face glowing despite her exhaustion. Daniel approached the bed cautiously, peering at the red-faced infant. "He's so small." "You were this small once," Nora told him, shifting the baby so Daniel could see him better. "What do you think we should call him?" Daniel considered the question with grave responsibility. "Edward," he finally said. "After your first husband, so he won't be forgotten." Preston and Nora exchanged startled glances. They had never explicitly told Daniel about Edward, though he knew that Nora had once had a daughter who died. "That's very thoughtful, Daniel," Nora said gently. "But perhaps as a middle name, your father and I were thinking of James for his first name after my father." Daniel nodded, satisfied with the compromise. "James Edward Sullivan," he tested the name. "I like it." Preston moved to the bed, sitting carefully beside his wife. "He's perfect," he whispered, touching the baby's downy head. "You're perfect." Nora leaned against him, their new son cradled between them. "We did this together," she said. "All of us." Daniel climbed onto the bed, fitting himself against Nora's other side. The four of them sat in peaceful silence as the snow fell outside. A family forged from loss and hardship, but bound now by something stronger. In the years that followed, the Sullivan Ranch prospered. Preston expanded his cattle operation, while Nora's medical practice became the cornerstone of health care in Walla Walla and the surrounding area. Daniel grew into a thoughtful young man with his father's determination and his stepmother's compassion, eventually leaving for medical school in Philadelphia with Nora's enthusiastic blessing. James was joined by two sisters, Emily Rose, named for the daughter Nora had lost, and Martha Grace, a tribute to Preston's first wife that Nora herself suggested. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Preston and Nora sat on the same porch where he had once proposed, watching their children play in the yard as the sun set over the Wyoming plains. "You ever regret it?" Preston asked. "Giving up your traveling practice? The hospital position in Denver?" Nora shook her head, her hand finding his. "Never. I thought I was meant to wander to atone for not being there when Emily needed me, but what I really needed was to stop running and find a place to belong." Preston raised her hand to his lips. "I'm glad you found it with us." She smiled, the same smile that had captivated him all those years ago in a ramshackle cabin during a thunderstorm. "I didn't just find a place, Preston Sullivan, I found a home." As twilight deepened into night, they remained on the porch, hands entwined, listening to the laughter of their children and the distant lowing of cattle, the soundtrack of a life neither had dared to dream possible before a desperate ride across the Wyoming wilderness had brought them together. A cowboy father and a traveling doctor, each seeking redemption and finding, instead, a love that healed them both.